Imagine this. Suddenly, silence spreads across Europe. The cannons that had thundered for 4 years have fallen silent. People are smiling, embracing one another, because the war is over. But this silence was not one of healing. It was a dangerous stillness. In 1918, the world believed that wars had finally ended. But in 1919, a few men sitting inside a single room drawing lines on maps laid the foundation for the next war. This is not a story of cannons. This is a story of signatures. This is not a tale of armies. This is a tale of humiliation, debt, and revenge. A treaty written in the name of peace, but one that broke a nation, buried an economy, and gave birth to a man who would set the world on fire. This is not the story of the Second World War. This is the story of the peace that made war inevitable. Slow, somber, black and white footage of the 1918 armistice celebrations. Smiling faces, cheering crowds, then a gradual fade to color footage of the 1919 Paris Peace Conference delegates looking stern and serious. The camera lingers on maps being drawn, borders being redrawn with rulers and pens. The color is slightly desaturated, giving a historical, archival feel. It began with an N. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, the guns fell silent across Europe. The Great War, the war to end all wars, was over. A collective sigh of relief echoed across a battered continent. The silence, after 4 years of unimaginable noise, was profound, but this was not a silence of healing. It was a tense, fragile quiet, pregnant with unresolved grievance. In the halls of Versailles, just outside Paris, the victors gathered not just to make peace, but to dictate it. They sought to build a new world order from the ashes of the old. Yet in their efforts to ensure such a catastrophe could never happen again, they constructed piece by piece the very foundations for an even greater one. This is not a story of battles and blitzkriegs, but of signatures and sanctions, of economics and emotion. This is the story of how the peace that ended the First World War made the second not just possible, but in the eyes of many, inevitable. Close-up shots of the Treaty of Versailles document the signatures at the bottom, montage of German newspaper headlines from 1919 screaming, Schande, disgrace, or Diktat, animated map showing the territorial losses of Germany, Alsace-Lorraine, fading into French color, the Polish corridor being carved out, Danzig becoming a free city. Portraits of the big three, Clemenceau, stern, Lloyd George, pragmatic, Wilson, idealistic. The Treaty of Versailles was not a negotiation. It was, as Germans immediately called it, a diktat, a dictated peace. The German delegation, excluded from the real talks, was presented with its terms and given a simple choice: sign or face a renewed Allied invasion. The clauses were severe, designed to cripple Germany's capacity for future war. Territorially, it shrank. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France. The Saarland was placed under international control. Valuable lands in the east were handed to a newly reborn Poland, physically separating East Prussia from the German mainland. All overseas colonies were confiscated. Militarily, it was humiliated. The army was slashed to a mere 100,000 men, a tiny police force for a nation of millions. The Air Force was banned. The Navy was reduced to a coastal patrol. The Rhineland, Germany's industrial heartland bordering France, was to be permanently demilitarized. But one clause, above all others, would become a festering wound. Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. It stated unequivocally that Germany and its allies bore sole responsibility for causing the war and all its loss and damage. This was not just a legal formality, it was the moral and financial keystone for the next most corrosive part of the treaty: reparations. Old footage of German banknotes being printed, then piled into worthless stacks. Children building blocks with bricks of currency. Hyperinflation, charts showing an almost vertical line. Then footage of the 1929 Wall Street crash. Ticker tape, frantic traders, followed by scenes of the global Great Depression. Soup kitchens, unemployed men in lines, silent factories. The reparations bill was astronomical, 132 billion gold marks, a sum so vast it was deliberately impossible to fully quantify. For the German people, already impoverished by war, this was not a bill, but a life sentence of debt and indignity. The war guilt clause made it digestible for the Allies. For Germans, it made it poisonous. The economic consequences were catastrophic. To pay, the German government resorted to printing money, triggering one of history's most extreme episodes of hyperinflation. By 1923, a loaf of bread cost billions of marks. Lifetimes of savings were wiped out overnight. The middle class, the bedrock of any stable society, was utterly destroyed, left clutching suitcases of worthless paper. This economic trauma did not just ruin wallets, it ruined faith. Faith in democracy, faith in the future, faith in the fairness of the world order. Just as Germany began a fragile recovery in the late 1920s, thanks to American loans and renegotiated debts, the second great economic earthquake struck. The Wall Street crash of 1929 sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. American loans dried up overnight. Global trade collapsed. The Great Depression descended. In Germany, unemployment soared to over 6 million. Despair was a national currency. The moderate democratic government of the Weimar Republic, associated with the shame of Versailles and now the misery of the Depression, was seen as weak, incompetent, a puppet of foreign powers. In times of stability, extremes are marginal. In times of desperation, they move to the center. The stage was now set, not for a politician, but for a prophet of rage. Early grainy footage of Adolf Hitler speaking, not the frenzied orator of later years, but a more intense, focused figure. Crowds listening, initially small, then growing. Animated map showing the gradual expansion of Nazi Germany from 1935 to 1939, the Saar, the Rhineland, Austria, Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia. Archival footage of Chamberlain waving his "Peace for our time" paper. Into this void of anger and humiliation stepped Adolf Hitler. His message was not complex, but it was powerfully resonant. He rejected Versailles utterly. He denounced the diktat, spat upon the war guilt clause, and promised to tear the reparations bill to pieces. He spoke not of international cooperation, but of national redemption, not of peace, but of rightful restoration. His foreign policy had a clear, uncompromising name: Lebensraum, living space. This was more than just a demand for lost territory. It was a racial ideological imperative, the need for the superior German folk to expand eastward into Slavic lands, to displace what he considered inferior peoples, and to secure an agricultural and resource base for a 1,000-year Reich. Versailles' land losses were not a political issue to him. They were a racial wound, and so he began to methodically dismantle the Versailles system, testing its strength at every turn. In 1935, he openly remilitarized, building an air force and introducing conscription. In 1936, he marched troops into the demilitarized Rhineland, a direct violation. In 1938, he annexed Austria, the Anschluss. Then he turned to the Sudetenland, the German-speaking parts of Czechoslovakia. Here, he encountered not resistance, but accommodation. The Western democracies, haunted by the memories of the First World War's trenches, were desperate to avoid another conflict. Their policy became appeasement, the belief that by reasonably addressing Hitler's legitimate grievances from Versailles, his appetite would be satisfied and peace would be preserved. The apogee of this policy came in September 1938 with the Munich Agreement. Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, believing he had achieved peace for our time, agreed to hand the Sudetenland to Hitler, betraying Czechoslovakia, a democratic ally. For Hitler, Munich was not a diplomatic solution. It was a revelation. It proved the Versailles powers were weak, divided, and would not fight. They would only protest. 6 months later, he swallowed the rest of Czechoslovakia. The promise of Lebensraum was no longer rhetoric. It was a working blueprint, map focusing on Poland, highlighting the Danzig corridor, newsreel footage of the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein shelling the Polish garrison at Westerplatte, black and white footage of Stuka dive bombers screaming down, then panning shots of German tanks, panzers, rolling across the Polish countryside, a final slow-motion shot of a border post being blown apart. By the summer of 1939, only one major provision of Versailles remained unshattered: the existence of an independent Poland with its corridor to the sea. Danzig, the predominantly German city within that corridor, became Hitler's next focal point. He demanded its return. This time, Britain and France, their eyes finally opened by the seizure of Prague, drew a line. They guaranteed Poland's borders. The stage was now set. Hitler, convinced the West would again back down, or at most put up a token fight, pressed on. He sealed a cynical pact with his ideological arch-enemy, Stalin's Soviet Union, to divide Poland between them. The last thread of the Versailles Order was pulled taut. On September 1st, 1939, the pretext came: a staged attack on a German radio station by Polish forces, using concentration camp prisoners in Polish uniforms as the supposed casualties. At 4:45 a.m., the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, on a courtesy visit to the port of Danzig, opened fire on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte. The Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, began. Tanks, aircraft, and motorized infantry poured across the border. It was not a war of trenches, but of terrifying, unstoppable motion. The response Britain and France feared, and Hitler gambled they would not make, came. 2 days later, they declared war on Germany. The shot of the exploding border post freezes, then slowly fades to a wide, still shot of the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, empty and quiet. The camera slowly pulls back as the image turns to sepia, then fades to black. The war that began that morning would consume the world, but its roots reached back deep into that Hall of Mirrors in 1919. Versailles sought to punish, to prevent, and to create a lasting peace. Instead, it bred a poison of resentment, created the economic desperation that demagogues thrive upon, and established an international order whose guardians were too weary, too guilty, or too afraid to defend it when challenged. The Second World War was not caused by the Treaty of Versailles alone. The unique evil of the Nazi ideology, the failures of appeasement, the ambition of a single man, all were essential sparks. But Versailles created the tinder. It built the dry, brittle structure of interwar Europe, waiting for a match. In the end, the peace treaty that ended one world war did not create a new world. It merely constructed a 20-year intermission, one of unquiet peace, filled with the growing, unmistakable sound of a storm gathering.